Introduction. You're listening to Captured by Fire, an Dragon Shifter romance, written by J.K. Jones, narrated by Val Vance and Casey Drew. Please be advised that this is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. This is protected by copyright law. No part of this book may be reproduced or distributed without the prior written consent of the author. If you like this story and would like to hear more, please like and subscribe, or join the Patreon. Thank you for respecting the hard work of the author, and we hope you enjoy the story.
Chapter 1. Quinn. You're tapping at it like a damn woodpecker, Quinn. If you're going to ruin my iron, at least do it with some conviction. I didn't look up. I didn't have the breath to spare. I just kept my eyes on the glowing orange of the ploughshare, my forearms burning as I forced the metal to obey. A heavy master hammer suddenly whistled past my knee and buried itself in the dirt floor with a dull thud. The shock of it made me jump, and the iron hissed as it slipped from my tongs and hit the floor. I rounded on the old man. "Are you trying to break my leg, Owen?" "Insolent fool," Owen spat. He didn't look sorry. He looked miserable. He stood there, his leather apron scorched and stiff, his chest heaving. His eyes darted to the corner where my rucksack sat, already packed for the morning. "Going off to war. You're a fool, Quinn McGregor, a total brainless fool." "The village has a quota," I said, wiping a streak of soot across my forehead with the back of my hand. "If I don't go, they take the winter grain. You want the miller's kids to starve? Or maybe you want to go in my place with that hip of yours." Ogan stomped toward me, his limp heavy. He grabbed a pair of tongs and shoved a horseshoe into the coals with a jerk of his arm that looked like it hurt. "Ha! The High King doesn't know you exist, Quinn. To him you're just another body to throw at a dragon to keep it busy while the lords drink their wine." "I'm not looking to be a hero, I'm just looking to keep this place standing." "By getting yourself killed." Owen's voice cracked. He turned his back to me, messing with the bellows even though the fire was already roaring. "I've spent 5 years teaching you how to read the heat. 5 years making sure you didn't blow your hands off. This shop, it was going to be yours. You're the only one left who actually gives a damn about the rhythm of the work." He didn't mention his son. We never talked about him. But I saw the way he looked at the empty stool by the back door, the one no one had sat on in 10 years. "I'm coming back," I said, but the words felt thin even to me. "Aye, everyone says that right before they get turned into ash," he muttered, his face hidden by a cloud of steam as he quenched a rod. "Go on then, stop standing there like a statue. Get the orders finished. If you're hell-bent on leaving, I'm not doing your work for you. I want every one of those scythes finished before you walk out that door." I didn't say another word. I just picked up my hammer and got back to it. I spent the next 10 hours in that heat. My shoulders went numb and the skin on my palms started to blister through the old calluses, but I didn't stop. I filled the orders for the herders, forged 3 dozen nails for the masonry team, and sharpened enough shears to clip every sheep in the Sunderlands. It was easier to keep my head down than to look at Owen, who just sat in the corner, staring into the fire and nursing a mug of ale that had gone warm hours ago. By the time the sun started to drop behind the jagged peaks, I was done. My lungs felt like they were lined with soot, and my tunic was stuck to my back. I threw a rag over my shoulder and looked at him. "I'll see you in the morning, Owen." "Watch your step," he grunted, not looking up. "The scouts say there's been movement in the woods. Don't go looking for trouble just because you've got a sword strapped to your pack." I stepped out into the night air, and it hit me like a bucket of ice water. It felt good after the forge, but it made my sweat-soaked tunic cling to my back. My legs were like lead, each step up the mountain path a chore. I just wanted a bowl of stew in my bed. Oakhaven was quiet. Most folks had their shutters bolted already, saving on candles and staying out of the draft. I kept my head down, humming a low tune to keep the dark at bay. My hand rested on the hilt of the heavy blade at my belt, a piece of scrap steel I'd turned into something sharp enough to shave with. My mother would be waiting with a bowl of watery turnip stew, probably fretting over the rucksack I'd left by the door. I was halfway up the rise when I heard it, the frantic, high-pitched bleat of a ewe. "Bess, you stupid sheep," I muttered. I didn't go home. I turned into the whispering woods, following the sound. Usually these woods were noisy with crickets and wind, but tonight they were dead silent. The further I walked, the worse it smelled. It wasn't the smell of pine anymore. It was the smell of a lightning strike and burnt hair. Then I saw the first scorch mark. It was a perfect circle of blackened earth, 10 feet wide. The grass inside was gone, replaced by grey ash. A few yards away was another one, then another. They looked like giant footprints made of fire. I drew my blade. My heart started thumping against my ribs. I pushed through a thicket of broken pines and stopped. The forest had been ripped open. A dragon lay sprawled across the rocks. It was a scout, not as big as the ones the stories talk about, but still the size of a fishing boat. Its copper scales were dull and leaking a thick, oily black fluid. One wing was snapped in half, draped over the trees like a rag. The ground around it was a mess. There were broken spears everywhere and the melted remains of black armor. Someone had fought this thing on the ground, and they hadn't played fair. "Bess?" I called out. My voice sounded small. I walked around the dragon's head, my boots crunching on burnt moss. That's when I saw a hand sticking out from under a pile of ferns. I knelt down, clearing the ash away. It was a man. He was nearly naked, his clothes just burnt ribbons of silk hanging off his hips. He was covered in soot and dried blood, but even under the dirt, he looked different. Expensive. He was tall, easily a head taller than me, with waist-length black hair tangled with pine needles. I reached out to check his neck, expecting him to be cold. The second my skin touched his, I jumped back. He was burning up. His skin felt like the iron I'd just pulled out of the coals. His eyes snapped open. "King's blessings!" I almost jumped 10 feet in the air. His eyes weren't human. There was no white, no color, just 2 solid black holes staring at me. He didn't blink. He just looked at me like I was something he was deciding whether to eat or ignore. Then his head rolled back and he went limp again. We were at war. I knew the stories of men trying to escape the Sunderlands. Some were successful, but most were just bones in the dirt. What if he was dangerous? What if he was the very thing my Da warned me about? But then I looked at his hands. They were curled into the muck, fingers twitching against the moss as if he were trying to hold on to the world itself. I stood there, the hammer heavy in my belt, and I knew I couldn't do it. I couldn't leave a man to rot alone in the dark. I took a breath, the scent of dragon smoke burn in my throat, and reached for his shoulder. Well, I whispered to the trees. I suppose the sheep won't mind the company. "Damn it, Quinn," I whispered. I sheathed my blade and grabbed him under the arms. I groaned as I took his weight. He was lithe, but he was heavy as stone. I started the long, slow trek back toward my barn, dragging the black-sighted stranger through the dirt. I bypassed the house, sticking to the shadows of the tall grass. My lungs were on fire, and the stranger's weight was pulling my shoulders out of their sockets. I reached the barn, nudged the heavy door open with my knee, and froze. A soft crunch came from the corner. 2 yellow eyes reflected the moonlight from the open door. Bess! She was standing there in her usual stall, calmly chewing on a mouthful of stolen grain, looking at me like I was the one who was lost. "Bess!" I hissed. You're here? I've been halfway to the reach looking for you, you miserable rug!" She just let out a bored bleat and went back to her grain. She must have slipped back through the lower hedge while I was busy staring at dragon carcasses. I stood there for a second, sweating and heaving, realizing I'd hiked into a war zone for a sheep that had been home the whole time. The man on my back let out a low, pained groan, his head rolling against my neck. His skin was so hot I could feel the fever through my tunic. "Right," I muttered, shaking it off. "Priority shift." I hauled him up the ladder to the loft. It was a clumsy, brutal climb, but I eventually rolled him onto a fresh pile of straw. I lit a small lantern, keeping the flame so low it barely reached the rafters. In the amber light, he looked even more unreal. His features were so angular they looked like they'd been carved from bone. His waist-length hair was a tangled mess of silk and ash. I'd never seen anyone like him in Oakhaven. I grabbed a bucket of water and a clean rag, sitting cross-legged beside him. I started at his shoulder, wiping away the soot and the dried blood from the dragon fire. His muscles were lean and hard, like a runner's, not bulky like mine. Since I usually spent my nights talking to Bess, the silence felt too heavy, so I just started rambling. I don't have any friends, you know. Ma says I don't need 'em, I said, the sound of the wind rattling the barn slats. She says friends just bring trouble and gossip, but I don't know. They seem like fun. I bet you have a lot of friends, not sheep for friends or grumpy old men like Owen. I rinsed the rag, the water turning a murky grey. Bess is all right, but as you can see, she's a traitor. And Owen, well, he just wants me to stay in the forge until I'm as bent and bitter as he is. I looked at the stranger's face. He was still out cold, his breathing shallow and hot. You're going to have to stay quiet. My da, he's got eyes like a fox. He thinks anyone with a sword is a bandit. And you look like you were born with one in your hand. I moved the rag down to his chest. My hand shook a little. I'm supposed to go to war soon, I whispered, the weight of the draft finally hitting me. I'm supposed to be fighting people who look like you, I guess. Not that I know who you are. I sat back on my heels, watching him. He was terrifyingly beautiful, a broken god in a pile of straw. I knew I was a fool for hiding him. I knew I should probably tell the village elders. But then I thought about his black eyes and the way the air seemed to hum around him, and I knew I wasn't telling a soul. I'll call you Oisin, I said softly, reaching out to tuck a stray lock of black hair behind his ear, after a ram I used to have. He was too pretty for his own good and never listened to a word I said, just for a bit, just until you're strong enough to fly away. The sun hadn't even cleared the peaks when I was already knee-deep in the daily grind. Ma was in the kitchen, her joints popping like dry kindling as she moved between the hearth and the table. She didn't say much, just pushed a heel of rye bread into my hand, her eyes lingering a second too long on my face. Da was already out by the fence, his back permanently hunched from 40 years of pulling stones out of the dirt. He was a man of few words and even fewer smiles, mostly just grunting at the sheep as if they understood his disappointment in the weather. I worked double time. I hauled 6 buckets of water from the well, chopped enough wood to last them 3 days, and made sure the grain bins were topped up. I did it all with one eye on the barn. You're a good lad, Quinn, Da muttered as I passed him with a heavy sack of feed. He didn't look at me, but he clapped a rough, calloused hand on my shoulder. It was as close to a goodbye as I was going to get. By mid-morning, it was time. I went into the cottage and pulled on my best tunic, the dark blue one without any burn holes from the forge. I splashed some cold water on my face, tried to tame my brown hair and headed for the village square. The square was a sea of homespun wool and nervous energy. Every boy from the valley was there. I saw the miller's oldest son, holding the fine skinning blade I'd finished for him just yesterday. He gave me a curt nod, testing the edge with his thumb. Then there were the others, the brawny lot from the lower farms who'd cornered me behind the tavern last winter and beat me until my ribs sang. I felt the weight of the knives I'd forged for myself, tucked hidden against my belt, and puffed out my chest. Standing in that line, surrounded by the smell of mud and wood smoke, I felt a swell of something I hadn't expected. Pride. I wasn't just a boy who smelled like sheep and coal anymore. I was a soldier of the Sunderlands. I signed the parchment with a steady hand, took the copper coin they gave us as a king's blessing, and then I ran. I didn't stop until I was back in the shadows of my barn. I climbed the ladder, my heart hammering against my ribs. Oisin was still there, buried in the straw. I knelt beside him, dipping a fresh rag into the water bucket. I started on his face this time, gently wiping the soot from those razor-sharp cheekbones and the bridge of his straight, elegant nose. He didn't look like anyone from around here. His skin was like ivory under the grime, his features so precise they looked dangerous. "I signed up," I whispered, my voice shaking. "I'm going tomorrow. They gave me a coin and everything." I moved the rag across his forehead, leaning in close. "When I go, will you take care of Ma and Da? You're big. You look like you could handle a wolf or a tax collector if you had to." Suddenly the air in the loft turned cold. A hand, long-fingered and surprisingly strong, clamped around my wrist. My breath hitched in my throat. I looked down and my heart stopped. Oisin's eyes were open. They weren't human. There was no white, no blue, no iris at all. Just two solid, depthless pools of ink-black void locking onto mine. He didn't move a muscle, but the sheer heat of his gaze felt like it was pinning me to the floorboards. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't pull away. I just sat there, frozen, staring into the black eyes of a god who had just woken up. Chapter 2. Quinn. Then, before I could even gasp, his hand shifted from my wrist to the back of my neck. He yanked me down to him. His lips were searing, a dry, desperate heat that tasted like sweet poppy seed milk. For a heartbeat, I was paralyzed, my nose pressed against his cheek, my hands splayed uselessly in the straw. It was the first time I'd ever been kissed. I scrambled backward, a strangled yelp tearing out of my throat. I shoved at his chest, hard, and his hand slipped from my neck as he fell back into the hay with a soft groan. I didn't wait to see if he'd wake up again. I staggered down the ladder so fast I nearly took the skin off my palms, my boots hitting the dirt floor with a heavy thud. Bess bleated in surprise as I burst through the barn doors and into the cool night air, my face flaming hot enough to melt iron. "King's blessing," I choked out, stumbling toward the fence line. What the hell was that?" I pressed my fingers to my lips. They were tingling, buzzing with a phantom heat that wouldn't go away. My pulse was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I stayed out there for hours, leaning against the cold stone of the well, watching the moon crawl across the sky. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those black voids. Was that how they thanked people where he came from? Or was he just deluded with the fever? By the time the damp morning mist started to roll in, I knew I couldn't leave him up there without water. I crept back into the barn, moving like a thief. I climbed the ladder inch by inch, peeking over the edge of the loft. He was fast asleep. His chest rose and fell in a slow, rhythmic heave, and the terrifying intensity from before was gone, replaced by the pale, fragile look of a man who'd lost too much blood. I moved quickly, my movements jerky and nervous. I dipped the rag into the bucket and started cleaning the rest of the soot from his arms, trying to keep my eyes fixed on his elbows or his collarbone, anywhere but his mouth. "Just the fever," I whispered to the empty loft, scrubbing a particularly stubborn patch of ash off his forearm. He didn't even know it was me, probably thought I was some princess or a silk-clad maid. The thought pinched at me, though I didn't know why. I looked at his long, elegant fingers, and then at my own. They were blunt and stained with the permanent grey of the forge. I finished as fast as I could, dumping the grey water out the loft window. I didn't talk this time. I couldn't. Every time I opened my mouth, I felt the ghost of that heat on my lips, and my face started to burn all over again. I left a hunk of bread and a full skin of water within his reach and practically fell down the ladder. I had a war to go to. I had a pack to finish. But as I walked back to the cottage to face Ma and Da before heading off to the forge, I couldn't help but feel a tingle of something else. Of something awakening. The walk into the village was longer than usual that morning, or maybe my boots just felt heavier. The mist hung low over the heather, stifling and damp, clinging to my woolens like a cold shroud. My thoughts were still back in that hayloft, stuck on the searing heat of that man's lips, and the way he'd gripped my neck. As I neared the well, the clink of the village hammers was drowned out by the hushed edge of the morning gossip. Oakhaven was a quiet place, but hunger and fear had a way of loosening tongues. "Another cart of grain taken," Old Man Miller spat, his face a map of deep, angry wrinkles. "Second one this month. The high bonder tithe is going to leave us eating nothing but dirt and prayer by winter." "Aye, and for what?" Mistress Gowan snapped, clutching her empty market basket to her chest. "To feed the iron-scaled drakes of the north? To fuel a war that started before we were born?" I slowed my pace, pretending to adjust the strap of my heavy pack. I'd heard the stories since I was a wean. The king of the Sunderlands, a man they called the Fallen General, had risen up 40 years ago. He wasn't born to a throne. He'd carved one out of the mountains with fire and blood, claiming he was purifying the realm. He'd spent decades trying to crush our kingdom, all because he claimed our ancestors had stolen the light from the dragons. "The damned king won't stop until every field is ash," Miller muttered, looking over his shoulder. "They say he's obsessed now. The high bonder dragons are fading, getting smaller, their fire turning to grey smoke. He's looking for an oracle. He wants a battery to tether to that boy of his so the prince can live forever and burn the world to a cinder." "Which is worse, I ask you?" Gowan scoffed, her voice dropping to a hiss. "The damned king or the evil prince? Vahl-Zulien is a monster in human skin. They call him the Ebon Drake. My cousin from the border says he doesn't just ride those black-scaled beasts, he is one, cold as obsidian. They say he burned a whole garrison of our boys just because they didn't kneel fast enough when his shadow crossed the sun." I shivered, the cold mist feeling like ice against my neck. Vahl-Zulien. Even the name sounded like a blade sliding out of a sheath. "The prince is dead anyway," a younger lad piped up, though his voice wavered. "His dragon was shot down over the crags 3 days ago, fell right out of the sky like a lead weight. No man survives a fall like that." "I'll believe he's dead when I see the bones," Miller grunted. "Until then, the taxes go up, the grain goes north, and we sit here waiting to see which one of them kills us first, the father or the son." I didn't stay to hear the rest. I hurried toward the forge, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. But as I reached the forge, the smell of hot iron didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a warning that the war was closer than any of us wanted to admit. The blacksmith forge was a furnace that never slept, and today the air felt dense enough to choke on. I was at the anvil, my shirt sticking to the muscles of my back, trying to hammer out the curve of a scythe. My mind was a mile away, back in the hayloft with the man who looked like he'd fallen from a different world, like a fallen angel. He was so damn pretty. My thoughts went back to his lips. I'd never seen lips on a man so pretty. It was almost girlish, and it made my heart throb painfully. It was forbidden in the realm for men to lust after other men. I'd have to pray to the gods for redemption, but I couldn't stop myself. I never could. It was another reason Ma said it was best I didn't have friends. Friends notice things, and we couldn't afford them to notice anything else. "You're overfiring the steel, Quinn. Look at the colour, you half-wit. It's turning brittle." Ogan barked from the shadows. He was leaning on his good leg, pointing a gnarled finger at the glowing metal. "If you spend as much time looking at the iron as you do staring at the door, we might actually finish the miller's order before the king's wagons arrive." "I've got it, Owen," I grunted, my breath hitching as I swung the hammer. "The heat is fine." "The heat is not fine. You're distracted. Ever since you signed that parchment, your head's been in the clouds." He limped closer. "You think a sword makes you a man. It just makes you a target. Stay here. Learn the temper. I've told you 1,000 times." The heavy wooden door of the smithy swung open with a bang, hitting the stone wall. The cool afternoon air rushed in, but it didn't bring any relief. Barnaby strolled in like he owned the dirt we stood on. He was broader than me, his chest puffed out under a leather vest, followed by 2 of his cousins, Liam and Silas. They were the kind of guys who'd spent their whole lives making mine miserable, mostly because I was the quiet shepherd boy who didn't fight back when they tripped me in the mud or hid my tools. Barnaby held up a short sword I'd finished 2 days ago, or what was left of it. The blade was snapped clean in half, the jagged edge dull and grey. "Look at this piece of slag," Barnaby sneered, tossing the broken hilt onto my clean workbench. It skittered across the wood, knocking over a tin of oil. I took it out to the woods to practice on a stump, and the damn thing shattered on the first strike. "You trying to get me killed on the front lines, McGregor?" I set my hammer down, my heart starting to thud. I knew I'd rushed that quench. I'd been too busy thinking about the black-eyed stranger in my barn to watch the oil temperature. "I'll reforge it, Barnaby," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just leave it there." "Reforge it?" Liam laughed from the doorway, spitting a glob of tobacco onto the floor. "With what? More pig iron? My cousin paid good silver for that. Silver his old man earned sweating in the fields." Barnaby stepped into my space, his shadow towering over me. He smelled like sour ale and horses. He reached out, poking a thick finger into the centre of my chest, right over my heart. "I don't want a new one. I want my silver back," he growled. "And I think I want a little extra for the trouble of walking all the way down here. Maybe a tax for the shoddy workmanship." "I don't have your silver, Barnaby," I said, my jaw tightening. "The shop keeps the coin. I just do the work." "Then maybe I'll just take it out of your hide," Barnaby said, his eyes narrowing. He looked at Owen, who was standing frozen by the bellows. "What do you say, old man? You going to defend your little pet? Or can we teach him how we treat cheats in this village?" Ogan's face went pale, his hand trembling on the handle of his tongs. He didn't move. He couldn't. He was an old man with a bad hip, and there were 3 of them. I felt the heat of the forge at my back and the cold weight of the knives I'd forged for myself hidden at my belt. I could have ended it right there. I could have shown them what a shepherd boy was capable of when he was pushed too far. But I thought of Ma and Da. I thought of the stranger in the loft who needed me to stay out of trouble. I reached into the small pouch at my waist, pulled out the few silver bits I'd saved from my own meagre wages, and slammed them onto the table. "Take it," I spat. "Take it and get out." Barnaby grinned, a slow, ugly thing. He swept the coins into his palm and winked at Silas. "See? I told you he was a coward. All that muscle and no spine, just like his sheep." He leaned in close to my ear, his voice a low hiss. "Enjoy your month of freedom, Quinn, because once we're in the trenches, there won't be any blacksmith shop to hide in, and I'll be watching your back very, very closely." They turned and walked out, their laughter echoing in the small shop. The silence that followed was heavy. Owen didn't look at me. He just went back to the bellows, the rhythmic whoosh of the air the only sound between us. "You shouldn't have given him the coin," he muttered finally. "I didn't have a choice," I said, picking up my hammer. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer effort of not wrapping them around Barnaby's throat. I worked until the sun went down, filling the orders with a savage intensity. I didn't stop to eat. I didn't stop to drink. I just let the fire and the iron drown out the sound of Barnaby's voice. Waiting for the moment I could finally head back to the barn and the only person who didn't look at me like I was something to be stepped on. Later on that day, I climbed the ladder into the loft with a groan, my knuckles raw and stinging from the day's labour. The barn was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of hay from the sheep below and the steady rhythmic breathing of the man I'd been hiding for weeks. I sat down on a crate near his makeshift bed, picking at a splinter in my thumb. The lantern light was dim, casting long, flickering shadows against the timber beams. "He's a prick, Oisin. Always has been," I muttered. I didn't want Ma or Da catching the sound of me talking through the barn walls. Barnaby, I mean. He's been a thorn in my side since we were kids, tripping me in the mud just to see if I'd cry. Today, he brought back a sword I forged, snapped right in two. I looked over at him. He didn't move, His long black hair spilled across the straw like silk. But he's right, I sighed, leaning my head back against a post. I messed up the cooling. I was rushing. My head's just... It's not in the iron anymore. I'm thinking about the wagons coming in a few weeks. I'm thinking about the front lines. And I'm thinking about... I trailed off, my eyes drifting to his mouth. I could still feel the phantom heat of that kiss from the first night, a brand I couldn't scrub off. I'm just not thinking about the work, I finished lamely. I paused, the silence of the loft suddenly feeling heavy. Usually, Oisin's breathing was a ragged, laboured sound that filled the small space, the sound of a man fighting for every lungful of air. But tonight it had changed. It was shallow, steady, even. Oisin? I leaned closer, the lantern light sliding over the bridge of his nose and those high, elegant cheekbones. The grey, sickly pallor was gone. His skin was starting to glow with a healthy ivory sheen, looking more like polished stone than bruised flesh. He looked like he was deep in a dream, his expression peaceful for the first time since I'd found him. "Are you even still asleep in there?" I asked, my heart doing a strange little skip. "Or are you just listening to me ramble like a fool?" He didn't answer. His eyelashes didn't even quiver. He just lay there, beautiful and still, radiating a warmth that seemed to push back the chill of the barn. I reached out, my hand hovering just an inch above his shoulder, wanting to feel if the fever was truly gone, but I pulled back at the last second. I couldn't risk him waking up and looking at me with those black eyes again. Not when I was this tired, not when I felt this small. "Fine," I whispered, blowing out the lantern. "Keep your secrets. I've got to get some sleep before Owen starts barking again." I climbed down the ladder, my boots hitting the dirt with a dull thud. After checking the latch on the barn door, I crossed the yard to the cottage. Inside, the air smelled of peat smoke and dried herbs. Ma was sitting by the hearth, her needle moving rhythmically through a thick wool sock. Pa was already nodding off in his chair, his chin resting on his chest. "Finished in the forge then?" Ma asked, not looking up, though I saw her eyes flick toward my raw knuckles. "Aye, Ma, just checking on the sheep before bed," I lied, the weight of the secret in the barn feeling like a stone in my pocket. "Get some sleep, Quinn," she said softly. "You look like death warmed up." I nodded, gave her a quick squeeze on the shoulder and retreated to my room. It was a tiny lean-to, just big enough for my rope bed and a chest for my clothes. I shucked off my boots and collapsed, pulling the scratchy wool blanket up to my chin. My mind was a mess. Barnaby's sneer, the broken sword, and the way the stranger's breathing had finally levelled out. I drifted off to the sound of the wind rattling the eaves. My eyes snapped open, the room was pitch black. I stayed perfectly still, listening. A noise. It came from the barn. My heart slammed against my ribs. I was out of bed in a second, my feet hitting the cold floorboards. I didn't grab a coat, I just grabbed the heavy belt knife I'd forged and my short sword, slipping out the window into the freezing night. The barn door was swinging wide, groaning on its hinges. I sprinted inside, my breath coming in short, jagged white clouds. The loft was empty, the straw was still warm, but Oisin was gone. "Damn it!" I hissed, looking at the open window in the back of the loft. I tracked his footsteps. The ground was damp with dew, and I could see the flattened ferns and the snapped twigs leading away from the farm and deep into the whispering woods. I followed the trail like a hound, my pulse hammering in my ears. I thought he was hurt or confused, or worse, that someone had taken him. I pushed through a thicket of silver birch and stopped dead. The hidden lake sat in a hollow of ancient stone, the water perfectly still and glowing under the twin moons like a pool of liquid mercury. And there, standing waist-deep in the luminous water, was the man. He wasn't broken anymore. The burns were gone, the gashes healed over as if they'd never been there. He was naked, his back to me, and he looked like something carved from ivory. His hair was a black river of silk that reached all the way to his waist, dripping with water that caught the moonlight. But it was his back that held me. His skin was covered in tattoos, intricate, swirling patterns of dragon scales and ancient script that seemed to move and shimmer under the water. They weren't just ink. They looked like they were part of him, a map of power I couldn't begin to understand. I stood behind a tree, my hand white-knuckled on the trunk. I was barely breathing, my heart in my throat. The moon caught the curve of his shoulder, the lean, lithe muscles of his back, and the line of his hip. My throat felt thick, so very thick I could barely swallow. And then there were other places rising too. Feelings Ma had talked about when I was younger, saying it was all just part of growing up. But no girl in the village had ever made my blood run hot like this. None of them made my skin feel too tight for my body. I stared at my own hands, braced against the bark. They were blunt, calloused, and stained with the permanent black of the forge. He was porcelain and ink, a lithe god in a silver lagoon. I was just a boy made of iron and dirt. I watched him move, the water rippling around his waist, and for the first time I wasn't afraid of the evil prince. I was terrified of the way he made me feel, like I'd been waiting my whole life for a man who didn't even know my name. I bolted. I didn't wait for him to turn, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I scrambled back through my window and dove under the covers. "Gods, Quinn, get a grip," I whispered into my pillow. I tried to focus on the forge, on the smell of the sheep, anything to drown out the image of the moon catching the curve of his hip. But my blood felt like molten lead, pooling heavy and insistent between my thighs. That traitorous part of me Ma warned would wake up one day wasn't just awake. It was screaming. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the ghost of his fingers on my neck and that searing, desperate kiss. It was pathetic. I was a month away from a dragon's fire, and I was losing my mind over a silent stranger who looked like a god while I was just a boy covered in soot. I lay there for hours, the heat in my veins refusing to simmer down, wondering if he was still out there in the silver water or back in the loft, waiting for me to break. The next morning, I walked into the loft with my face already burning. I'd barely slept, my skin still feeling too tight after what I'd seen at the lake. I expected him to be slumped in the straw, but the second my head cleared the floorboards, I froze. He was sitting upright. His long black hair was a messy silk curtain over his shoulders, and those solid black eyes were fixed right on me. You're awake," I stammered, nearly dropping the bowl of porridge. "Thank you," he said. His voice was a low, melodic rasp that sent a shiver straight down my spine. It didn't sound like any voice I'd ever heard in Oakhaven. I stood there for a heartbeat too long, clutching the empty bucket. The silence in the loft stretched, thick and awkward, broken only by the sound of a distant hawk circling the crags. He was watching me with those dark, unreadable eyes, and the ghost of that kiss felt like it was glowing on my lips. "Well, it's no trouble really," I yammered, my words stumbling over each other as I stepped back toward the ladder. "I mean, I couldn't just leave you to rot, could I? My ma would have my hide if I let a soul perish on our land. Not that she knows. About you. Being here." I wiped my sweaty palms on my breeches, my face heating up. "I brought some bread. It's a bit hard, mind, but it'll fill the hole, and the water's fresh from the well." He didn't reach for the food. He just kept staring, his head tilted slightly, like I was a strange new species of bird he'd never seen before. "You've been thorough," he murmured, his gaze dropping to his clean forearms. Well, soot's a devil to get out once it sets," I said, my voice cracking. I started to fidget with a loose piece of straw. "And I had to check for more wounds, under the tunic, professional-like, because of the infection risk, not for any other reason. I was digging a hole so deep I'd never climb out. I needed him to say something, anything, to stop me from talking." "I'm healed," he announced suddenly, shifting his weight. He moved with a sudden, lethal grace that made the hay rustle. The fever has broken. I can stand. The second he said it, the tension in my chest snapped, replaced by a frantic, nervous energy. He was better, already. Healed? Just like that? I jumped toward him, the bucket clattering against the floorboards as I forgot all about staying my distance. But you were a right mess yesterday. Are you sure? Don't go spilling your guts back out on my clean straw. I leaned in, peering at him. If you're fit to stand, then you're fit to help. We're short-handed with the war taking the able-bodied men. Can you skin a cottontail? Or shave a sheep without nicking the hide? I need someone who can handle a shovel too. The horses haven't had their stalls mucked in 3 days. And for the love of the king, where are you from? You don't talk like a Sunderlander, but you surely don't sound like a local lad. His eyes darted away for a split second, tracking a moth against the rafters. North. Sheep. North sheep. I stroked my chin, frowning. I ain't ever heard of North sheep. Is that nearby? Yes. He seemed to be picking words out of the air like they were flies. Near Barn Village. Barn Village, eh? I beamed, my chest puffing out a bit. A neighbour, sort of. Huh. What do you do there? Farming. Oh, you're a farmer. King's blessings. We could certainly use one around here. My Da's back is gone and I'm off to the front in a month. You'll be a godsend. He was, without a doubt, the worst farmer in the history of the Sunderlands. By noon, I was staring at him in disbelief, convinced the fever hadn't just cooked his blood, it had scrambled his entire brain. I'd handed him a dull skinning knife and a rabbit, and the man just stood there, holding the thing at arm's length, like it was a vial of unstable alchemist's fire. He peered at the rabbit with a look of profound, offended confusion, as if he expected the creature to apologize for being dead and skin itself out of sheer respect for his presence. It's a cottontail, lad, not a holy relic, I muttered, snatching the knife back before he accidentally lobbed a finger off. You just... never mind. Follow me. I figured water was a safer bet. Hard to mess up a bucket, right? Wrong. When I asked him to help me haul from the well, he moved with a grace that was admittedly beautiful to watch, all long limbs and effortless power, but he didn't seem to understand the basic physics of a handle. He just stood there, tall and lithe, staring at the wooden pail as if waiting for it to levitate and fill itself on his command. He didn't lift a finger, but he watched me heave the sloshing weight with so much intensity I felt like I was being hunted. The hair on my arms stood up, and I nearly tripped over my own boots twice. The water goes in the bucket, and then the human carries the bucket, I snapped, wiping a bead of sweat from my nose. Is that how they do it where you're from? Or do the pails just develop legs and walk themselves to the kitchen? He just tilted his head, his dark eyes tracking the movement of my throat as I swallowed. I have never had the occasion to carry one, he rasped, sounding genuinely perplexed. Oh, aye? And what were ye in your past life? A decorative statue? I huffed, grabbing both handles and stomping toward the cottage. You're lucky you're pretty, stranger, because you're about as useful as a glass hammer. And the sheep. They didn't even stand a chance. I didn't know it was possible for a person to be so absolutely useless. You ever actually seen a sheep, Oisin? I sighed, wiping sweat from my brow as I finished the rabbit myself. He didn't answer, just kept those ink-black eyes tracking the play of my muscles while I worked. He wasn't weak, I'd seen him move. He was just observing, like a cat watching a mouse build its nest. Later that evening, after the chores were done and my parents were in the house, I took my wooden practice sword out to the yard. I had to stay focused. I moved through the basic forms Ogun had taught me, the wood whistling through the air. I could feel him. Even without looking, I knew he was standing in the shadows of the barn door. Every time I pivoted, Every time I stretched my shoulders or lunged, I felt his gaze like a chain dragging against my skin. It was a strange gravity, a pull I didn't understand. It made my movements feel focused, more performative. I wanted him to see me. I wanted him to see that I wasn't just a boy who scooped manure. I could fight too. I'd be someone important, someone who fought in the wars for our damned king, someone who'd be recognized. I finished a set, breathing hard, the cool night air stinging my lungs. I turned toward the barn. He was there, a dark silhouette against the hay, his black eyes watching. "I'm going to be a general one day," I said, mostly to fill the silence that made my heart race. He didn't laugh like the others did. He looked at my soot-stained hands, then back to my eyes, his gaze so steady it made my skin prickle. The words felt small as soon as they left my mouth, a childish boast tossed into the vast cold night. I waited for the scoff. I waited for him to tell me I was just a lad with a hammer and a dream too big for his boots, the way the men in the village did when they'd had too much ale. But he didn't do anything. I shifted my weight, suddenly embarrassed by my own bravado. I wiped my palms on my breeches and looked away first, unable to hold that dark stare any longer. "Right," I muttered to the dirt, my face heating up. I'll go get the water." When I stole a glance back at the loft, he was still there, a silent shadow in the hay, watching me go as if I were the most interesting thing he'd ever seen and the most confusing.
Chapter 3. Oisin. There was something different about this boy. I had noticed it, the light simmering beneath his skin like live wire. "What is it?" My eyes narrowed, watching him. He was pure, light. It made my mouth water, a strange possessiveness welling up deep like a tidal wave of a tsunami held back by a wooden bridge. He tasted of pure sunlight, of sunflowers, of fire, dragon fire. It throbbed through me, and it took all of my strength not to take him. That and the smell of this place was offensive. Manure, damp wool, and the cloying scent of low-born poverty. In the Drakenreach, the air tasted of sulfur and high-altitude snow. Here, it tasted of rot. I watched the boy. Quinn stumbled through the loft, his face a bright, mortifying red. He had seen me at the lake. Bare. I had felt his gaze on my skin like a branding iron, heavy and heat-stained. He thought he was being subtle. He didn't realize that a high bonder can feel the pulse of a rabbit from a mile away. His heart had been thundering so loud I was surprised it didn't wake his aged parents in the cottage. "North. Sheep," I had lied, the words feeling like gravel in my throat. He actually believed me. The boy was as thick as the iron he hammered, yet there was a light in his blue eyes that I found distracting. For starters, he talked incessantly. He told me about his sheep, which apparently have more personality than most of my father's court, and his grumpy old blacksmith, a man who seemed entirely too rude for someone who had supposedly chosen this boy as his successor. It was an exercise in patience to listen to him prattle on about the king's blessing, while my own world lay in ash. It was a constant stream of useless rural nonsense, but I found myself leaning into the sound of it. It drowned out the screaming silence in my head where Vermathus's voice used to be. My dragon was dead. I had wept bitterly upon realizing he'd been shot out of the sky, pierced by an iron spear straight through the heart. In the Drakenreach, a rider is only half a soul. The dragon is the other, the tether that anchors us to the sky and the ancient fire. To lose a bondmate is to have your very essence bifurcated, leaving a raw, jagged edge where a god once resided. Without him, the world felt muffled, colorless, as if I were viewing life through a pane of smoked glass. The ache in my chest seemed to grow with every passing hour, a hollow resonance that thrummed with the phantom vibration of wings that would never beat again. I looked at my hands. The dragon fire hadn't returned. When a great drake falls, the rider is hollowed out. I was a vessel with a hole in the bottom, trying to catch rain. Until my internal fire sparked again, I was just a man. A tall, useless man who couldn't even skin a rabbit without looking like he wanted to execute it. I followed him into the village one afternoon, keeping to the shadows of the eaves. I needed to scout. I needed a way back to Xyraxos, but what I saw sickened me. Oakhaven was a tomb for the living. The current king's rule was a slow strangulation. I saw children with ribs poking through their tunics, men with hollow eyes trading their last copper for a bit of sour ale, and the conscription posters promising glory while the streets smelled of starvation. In my kingdom, poverty was a failure of the crown. Here, it was a weapon. I was pulled from my thoughts by the sound of meat hitting meat. Found your spine yet, McGregor? Or did you leave it in the sheep-shagging barn? I turned the corner, the shadows of the alleyway clinging to me like a second skin. Quinn was backed against the stone wall of the tanner's shack, his breath coming in short, jagged bursts that I could feel from across the yard. I had never seen these three before, but I recognized them instantly from Quinn's incessant rambling. There they were from the forge. The leader, Barnaby, if the boy's stories were to be believed, had a handful of Quinn's tunic bunched in his fist, his knuckles white against the rough wool. The other two circled him like mangy curs around a cornered fox, their laughter a low, ugly sound that grated against the silence of my mind. I leaned against the cold stone of the neighboring wall, my eyes narrowing as I watched the scene unfold. So, these were the great tormentors of Oakhaven. These were the peasants who dared to lay hands on a light that made my own mouth water. A strange, cold heat began to stir in my gut, a ripple of the tsunami reaching the edge of the bridge. They were nothing, insects crawling in the dirt. And yet, as I watched Barnaby shove the boy against the stone, I felt a growl vibrate in the hollow where my dragon used to be. Quinn looked small against them, his blue eyes wide and flickering with that distracting, vibrant fire. He didn't see me. None of them did. To them, the alley was empty. To me, it was a stage, and I was beginning to wonder exactly how much blood it would take to wash the insult of their touch from the air. Quinn didn't draw his knives. He didn't even raise his fists. He just looked at them with that infuriating, honorable patience. "I don't want to fight you, Barnaby," Quinn said, his voice steady even as a trickle of blood ran from his lip. "That's because you're a coward," Barnaby sneered, and delivered a heavy blow to Quinn's stomach. Quinn doubled over, gasping. I felt a surge of cold, draconic rage that had nothing to do with my missing fire. This man had cleaned my wounds. He had fed me bread he couldn't afford. He was mine to torment, not theirs. I stepped out of the shadows. I was still weak, my balance slightly off, but I towered over them. "Leave him be," I snarled, my fist clenched. Barnaby looked up, his eyes widening at my height and my black eyes, but then he saw my thin frame and my lack of a weapon. He laughed. "Look at this. The refugee wants to play hero. Get him, boys." It was a disaster. I had the technique of a 1,000-year bloodline, but I had the strength of a newborn kitten. I broke Silas's nose with a palm strike, but then Barnaby's fist caught me in the ribs, sending a white-hot spike of pain through my healing chest. Quinn let out a roar, a surprisingly primal sound, and threw himself into the fray to pull them off me. For 5 minutes, it was just a blur of mud and teeth. Quinn fought like a maddened bear, taking hits meant for me, while I used every ounce of my remaining grace to trip and strike. In the end, we were both sprawled in the mud, gasping for air while the bullies retreated, nursing bruised egos and bloodied faces. Quinn looked at me, his eye swelling shut, and his lip split in 3 places. "King's blessing, Oisin," he wheezed, wiping a hand across his bloody face. "You're a terrible farmer, and you're an even worse fighter." He started to laugh. a deep, chesty sound that echoed off the stone walls. I looked at him, my own blood copper-sweet in my mouth, and for the first time in my life I didn't feel like a prince or a dragon rider. I felt seen. "You are a fool, Quinn McGregor," I whispered, reaching out to wipe a smudge of mud from his forehead. "Aye," he grinned, leaning into my touch without even realizing it. "But I'm your fool, apparently." I withdrew my hand, my black eyes narrowing. "Not just mine, little shepherd," I thought. "By the time I'm done with you, the world will forget you ever belonged to anyone else." The month had been a slow, agonizing crawl of recovery. My fire remained a cold pit in my chest, but my body had begun to remember its lethargy was only temporary. I spent my days watching the McGregors. The parents were wretched, fragile creatures. Without Quinn, they would be reclaimed by the dirt within a season. It was a pathetic sight, yet I found myself standing in the shadows of the eaves, ensuring the old man didn't collapse while hauling his stones. I had slipped into the village under the cover of a rainstorm to send a coded message through a black market courier, a man who didn't ask why a refugee had a ring worth a small manor. My men would come. They would ensure these peasants didn't starve while I was gone. It was a debt. A high bonder always pays his debts. But Quinn was a different matter. He spent his final hours polishing his scrap iron blades, talking of glory and duty to the crown. He spoke of this king as if the man were a god, rather than the bloated, paranoid leech I knew him to be. I watched him from the loft, my lip curling in a silent sneer. "He's a good king, Oisín," Quinn said, looking up from his whetstone. "Tough, but he keeps the Salvadorian monsters away. You'll see. When we get to the front, we'll be part of something great." "You are a dreamer," I rasped, my voice finally finding its edge. "And dreams are the first thing to burn in a dragon's breath." Quinn went quiet for a moment, the only sound the shifting of the sheep below us. "Do you have anyone waiting for you back there, in Barn Village or wherever it is? Brothers, a sister, a girl?" The stupid question hit me harder than I thought. I thought of the obsidian spires, of the brothers I had sparred with in the high courts, men who were likely at this very moment mourning my death, or, more likely, plotting to seize my command. I thought of the sisters who rode with the wind in their hair and fire in their veins. "I had half-brothers," I said, the truth tasting like iron in my mouth. "Two of them. We fought. Often." They didn't understand the cost of the crown we were born to protect, I thought. "Are they still there?" Quinn asked, his voice full of that annoying peasant sympathy. "They are exactly where they chose to be," I replied coldly. "And no, there is no girl. In my world, we do not marry for love. We bind ourselves to bloodlines and power. It is a transaction of the soul." What did he know anyway? His entire world was Oakhaven. Dragons do not mate for love. They mate for power. Besides, my preferences tended to lean toward the male variety, which I knew in this kingdom was very much outlawed. And besides, it wouldn't matter if I did or didn't have a wife. "Do you?" Quinn asked almost desperately. I smiled ruefully. "None of your business, little shepherd." "Shut up. I'm not little. I'm just sorry for you. I'd rather be a blacksmith in a soot-stained tunic who's allowed to dream of a real life than some farmer in a cage who has to trade his soul for a bloodline." "And what do you know of it?" I scoffed. "I thought your sheep were your only friends." Quinn winced, a small flash of hurt crossing his face that he tried to hide by picking at a callus on his palm. "I mean, that sounds lonely, even with all that power." "It is necessary," I snapped, turning my face toward the shadows. I didn't tell him that my brothers were currently leading the very monsters he intended to fight. I didn't tell him that the dragon he had found rotting in the moss was the only creature I had ever truly loved. And I certainly didn't tell him that if my fire returned, I would have to choose between burning his world to the ground or letting mine crumble into ash. Whatever. I need some air, I said, walking out of the barn. I stood there for a while, not sure what I was thinking or feeling. I just knew I had to get out of here, and quick. The morning of the conscription arrived with the beat of iron-shod hooves. The king's men didn't knock. They simply arrived like a plague. I stood in the shadows of the barn as the sergeant, a man with a face like curdled milk, barked names from a parchment. Quinn stood tall, his chest puffed out in that ridiculous blue tunic. He looked proud. It made me want to strike him. "Quinn McGregor," the sergeant bellowed. "Present," Quinn said. The sergeant's eyes drifted past Quinn, landing on the barn door. He saw me. I didn't hide. I stepped out into the light, my height forcing the soldiers to crane their necks. Even in my borrowed rags, I felt the familiar weight of my own authority, though I had no fire to back it up. "And who's this tall streak of piss?" the sergeant sneered, hand dropping to his sword hilt. "Another able body for the trenches. Refugee?" "He's sick." Quinn stepped forward, his hands out as if he could shield me. "Sergeant, please. He's my cousin from the north. He's got the lung rot. He can't fight. He can barely stand." I felt a spark of something, not dragon fire, but a human irritation. "Sick?" The sergeant laughed, poking a pike into my chest. "He looks healthy enough to carry a shield. If he can walk, he can bleed for the king. Chain him up with the rest of the scum." "No!" Quinn's voice was frantic now. He turned to me, his blue eyes wide with a terror he hadn't shown for himself. "Oisín, tell them. Tell them you can't." I looked at Quinn, then at the sergeant. I could have broken the man's neck in 3 moves, but there were 20 more behind him. And more importantly, if I stayed with Quinn, I stayed near the front. I stayed near the war I intended to finish. I didn't say a word. I simply stepped forward, towering over the sergeant until he flinched. I held out my wrists for the cold iron of the shackles. "Oisín, no," Quinn whispered, his pride vanishing, replaced by a crushing guilt. As the chains snapped shut, I leaned down, my lips grazing the shell of Quinn's ear. The same heat from the lake, that strange gravity, flared between us. "Quiet, little shepherd," I hissed, my black eyes locking onto his. "You wanted to see the world. Now I will show you what it actually looks like." He stared back at me in shock, but didn't dare say another word.
You're listening to an audiobook by J.K. Jones. Thank you for being here. If you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to like, subscribe, and consider supporting through Patreon. Every bit of help goes a long way in keeping this channel alive and independent. Now, let's get back to the story.
Chapter 4. Oisín. The march was a special kind of misery, made worse by the fact that Quinn seemed to think I was made of spun glass. The boy was relentless. Every time the wind picked up, he was there, hovering over me like a mother hen. He'd stripped off his own heavy wool cloak and draped it over my shoulders before I could even tell him to back off. Then he insisted on trading boots because his were broken in and mine were apparently leaking. I was a high bonder of the obsidian spires. I had survived the freezing altitudes of the Great Divide on the back of a dragon. And here I was, trekking through the mud in a peasant's oversized boots, while he fretted over whether I was catching a cold. "You're shivering, Oisín," he'd whisper, his face full of that earnest, annoying concern. "I am fine, Quinn," I'd snap, though the truth was my ribs still felt like they were being poked with hot needles every time I took a deep breath. Then we finally reached the front, and Quinn's glory hit him square in the face. It wasn't a battlefield. It was a slaughterhouse. The mighty army he'd been dreaming about was a collection of starving boys, huddled in trenches that smelled like a sewer. I watched a wagon roll past carrying veterans, which apparently meant anyone who had managed to keep most of their limbs while being roasted alive. They were screaming for their mothers, their skin peeling off in blackened sheets. I looked at the equipment they were handing us. The armor was boiled leather so thin a kitchen knife could get through it. I picked up one of the swords and nearly laughed. The balance was pathetic. It wasn't a weapon, it was a heavy, rusted paperweight. Quinn stood beside me, his face turning a lovely shade of gray as he touched a pile of pikes that were more rust than steel. This isn't right," he whispered. "The king said we were the greatest. He said we were the shield of the world." "Your king is a liar who stays warm while you turn into charcoal," I said. A group of men staggered past, their hair singed off and their eyes hollow. One of them was weeping, his hands a mess of weeping blisters. A sharp, jagged knot of something that felt suspiciously like fear tightened in my chest. It wasn't for me. I knew how to survive a massacre. It was for this stupid, oversized sheep herder. He was standing there with a blunt blade and a heart full of fairy tales, ready to rush into a wall of dragon fire. "Listen to me," I hissed, grabbing his tunic and hauling him close. The gravity between us was frantic now, pulling us together in the middle of the carnage. "When the bells ring, you stay behind me. Do you hear me? You stay behind the sickly cousin you spent a month coddling." "Oisin, you're still hurt," he argued, his blue eyes wide with that terrifying, misplaced bravery. "I'm the blacksmith. I'm the one who's supposed to do the fighting." "You are a moron," I snapped. I wanted to shake some sense into him. I'd seen my own brothers turn legions of men like him into ash in a single breath. But my fire was still just a mocking little spark in my gut, and my ribs were still screaming. I was a prince without a throne, a rider without a beast, and I was tethered to a boy who was walking toward his death with a smile on his face. "Stay close," I commanded, my black eyes boring into his. "If you die for this hollow king, Quinn McGregor, I will find your soul in the Sunderlands and kill you again myself." Quinn swallowed hard, his throat bobbing as he stared at me, trapped between terror and that stubborn, infuriating spark of light. He just nodded once. Perhaps it was my hard grip on his shoulder, anchoring him to the spot. I turned away before the heat in my palms could betray me. We moved through the outskirts of the village, sticking to the long shadows cast by the tanners' shacks and the jagged stone walls. The air smelled of wet soot, and the low, anxious murmur of men being herded like cattle toward the town square. That was the thing about this great army. The king didn't trust his own people as far as he could throw them. As we approached the main thoroughfare, I saw the High Bonder scouts, my father's own iron scales, patrolling the perimeter with their crossbows leveled not at the horizon but at the very men they were supposed to be leading. They weren't recruiting. They were harvesting. "Move it, you lot," the sergeant barked, shoving us toward a row of sagging, mildewed tents. He didn't unlock the irons. Instead, he looped the long center link of our chain around a heavy iron stake driven deep into the frozen mud inside the tent. With a click, he padlocked us to the ground. "Wait," Quinn shouted, his face reddening. "We signed the parchment. We're volunteers. Why are we chained like common thieves?" The sergeant paused, a jagged, toothless grin spreading across his face. "Volunteers, are ya? That's cute. Half the volunteers from the last wagon tried to bolt into the woods the second they smelled a dragon's fart. You're staying put until the morning bells. Then you'll get your spears and you'll stay in the trench because there's nowhere else to go." He slapped the tent flap shut, leaving us in the dim gray light. Quinn slumped down onto a pile of damp straw, the chain rattling between us. He looked at his wrists, then at mine. The pride he'd been carrying around Oakhaven like a trophy was officially dead. "He's treating us like dogs, Oisin," Quinn whispered. I thought we were going to be heroes. I thought we were the shield." "You're the fodder, Quinn," I said, sitting cross-legged and testing the tension of the stake. It didn't budge. "The chains aren't to keep the enemy out. They're to keep the heroes from running home to their mothers." Quinn shifted beside me, his shoulders tense as he scanned the huddled shapes in the dimness. His breath hitched and he nudged my arm, nodding toward the far corner of the canvas. "Oisin," he whispered. "Look." In the corner, slumped against a pile of moldy grain sacks, were two of the bullies that had beaten us up. Barnaby and Liam. They weren't laughing now. The brawny, dull-witted terrors of the forge were suspiciously quiet, their faces pale and streaked with dirt. Barnaby was staring at his own boots as if they were a death sentence, while Liam gripped a rusted short sword with trembling hands. Quinn's eyes darted around the rest of the tent, searching the faces of the terrified boys. He went still. Silas isn't with them. We shared a look, a long, heavy moment of silent understanding. They finally got what they wanted, I thought, watching the way the gray light caught the sweat on Quinn's brow. They wanted to be soldiers. They just didn't realize that in this army, a soldier is just a piece of wood meant to slow the fire. Quinn reached out, his hand shaking as he touched the cold iron of the stake. "I'm sorry. I dragged you into this. I thought I was saving you, and now I've got you chained to a hole in the dirt." I looked at him, really looked at him. His blue eyes were wide with terror and that same stubborn protective streak. Even shackled to a floor, he was trying to figure out how to make me comfortable. "Stop apologizing," I said. "Just shut up." I caught his gaze, my black eyes reflecting the tiny bit of light left in the tent. That spark in my gut, the one I'd been nursing since the lake, gave a cutting, hot flick. Quinn swallowed hard, his pulse jumping in the hollow of his throat. He was terrified, sure, but he didn't pull away. He leaned into me instead, seeking the heat of the sickly man he still thought he was protecting. He was a fool, but he was my fool. And if I had to burn this entire camp to the ground to get him out of these chains, I'd enjoy every second of the smoke. The next morning, the camp woke up to the sound of a rusted bell and the distant, bone-shaking roar of something that definitely wasn't a mountain lion. Quinn was already up, his face pale and his eyes bloodshot from a night spent staring at the tent ceiling. He was still trying to protect me, sitting in a way that blocked the draft from the tent flap. "Don't worry, Oisin," he whispered. "I'll talk to the sergeant. I'll tell him you're too weak for the vanguard. I'll—" "Shut up, Quinn," I said, my eyes fixed on the gap in the canvas. I wasn't looking for the sergeant. I was looking for someone. I scanned the muddy thoroughfare, watching the miserable ranks of volunteers shuffle past, until I saw him. A scarred veteran with a jagged line across his throat, wearing the faded blue of the king's infantry. But tucked into the leather of his bracer was a small, dull piece of black and silver, a signet that didn't belong to any lord in this wretched kingdom. A sleeper. One of mine. I caught his eye and gave an imperceptible tilt of my head. The man didn't react, he just kept walking. 10 minutes later, the tent flap shoved open. It wasn't the earless sergeant. It was the veteran. He didn't say a word. He just knelt in the mud, produced a set of master keys, and with 2 clean clicks, the irons fell away from our wrists. Quinn's jaw hit his chest. "What? How?" The man didn't answer. He reached into a burlap sack and tossed 2 sets of armor onto the straw. It wasn't the boiled cowhide the other sops were wearing. It was high-grade, blackened steel, light, flexible, and forged so well that made the camp's supply tent look like a scrap heap. "Put it on," I commanded, already sliding the greaves over my legs. "Quickly." Quinn scrambled into the gear, his hands shaking as he buckled the chest plate. He looked at the quality of the metal, then back at the silent soldier who was already slipping back out into the mist. "King's blessing," Quinn beamed, his blue eyes lighting up with that same terrifyingly earnest hope. "What luck! Oisin, did you see that? He must have seen how sick you were. There's still good men in this army, I told you. A real hero, that one." I nearly choked on my own tongue. Luck? I just signaled a high-level deep-cover operative to risk his life for a blacksmith's boy, and Quinn thought it was a random act of kindness. "Yes, Quinn, extraordinary luck," I said, my voice dry enough to catch fire. I helped him tighten the straps on his spalders, my fingers lingering for a second against the cold steel. He looked like a real soldier now, not just a sacrifice. The gravity between us felt different with the armor between us, less fragile, more dangerous. "Stay behind me today," I told him, my black eyes locking onto his. "The hero gave us the steel, but the steel won't save you if you're a moron." "I've got your back, Oisin," he grinned, adjusting his helm. "Luck's on our side now." I turned away so he wouldn't see me roll my eyes. Luck had nothing to do with it. But as we stepped out of the tent and into the freezing mud, I felt that heat in my gut flare. If my fire wouldn't return, I'd just have to make do with the steel, and the beautiful, oblivious fool currently thanking the gods for a miracle I'd bought with blood. The moon was a sliver of bone in a sky choked with wood smoke. I slipped through the perimeter of the camp, my movements silent and fluid, the sickly refugee persona sloughing off like dead skin. The veteran was waiting in the hollow of a lightning-struck oak. The moment he saw me, he didn't just stand. He dropped to one knee in the freezing mud, his head bowed. "My prince," he rasped, the sound of it grounding me. "Drahal Drakon has been scouring the high heavens looking for you. His riders have been spotted as far south as the Grey Reach." "I bet he has," I sneered, my voice dripping with the ice of the Sunderlands. "To kill me. My half-brother doesn't want a rescued sibling. He wants a confirmed corpse to clear his path to the throne." I reached out, my fingers trembling slightly with a cold, sharp rage. "Get a message to my mother and my eldest sister. Tell them the betrayal is complete. Drahal has made his move, and he thinks the dragonfire died with my beast. Tell them to hold the obsidian gate. I am coming, and I am not coming alone." The soldier nodded, vanished into the mist like a shadow, and I turned back toward the camp. I was nearly at our tent when I saw him. Quinn. The idiot was standing by the supply wagon, looking around with that wide-eyed, panicked concern he always wore when I wasn't in his sight. It was past curfew. The king's patrols were already prowling the rows with iron pikes and zero patience. The sound of armor was 10 paces away. I didn't think. I lunged from the shadows, grabbing Quinn by the front of his new steel breastplate and hauling him into the narrow, dark gap between two supply wagons. "Oisin, is that—" I didn't let him finish. To keep him quiet, I crashed my mouth against his. It wasn't a gentle thing. It was a collision of teeth and desperation. Quinn let out a muffled, shocked cry against my lips, but I silenced him with my tongue, kissing him hard and viciously. I took his face in my hands, those blunt blacksmith hands that had washed my wounds, and I relished the soft, broken sounds he made in the back of his throat. He was so soft, yet so hard, so innocent, and I drank from him like a man dying of thirst. We stayed like that for minutes, maybe hours, the world outside the wagons disappearing into a blur of friction and heat. I felt his hands find my waist, gripping me with a strength that made my blood sing. I finally yanked away, my lips throbbing, my breath coming in jagged hitches. The gravity wasn't just pulling now, it was burning. My entire body was suddenly flooded with a familiar, terrifying dragon heat. Nobody knew this about the High Bonder bloodline, not the peasants, not even the lesser lords. The quickest way to reignite the fire when a dragon falls wasn't through meditation or prayer. It was through the blood, the heat, and the soul-binding of procreation. The more I felt for him, the more the embers in my gut turned into a roar. Quinn leaned against the wagon, his eyes blown wide, his mouth bruised and wet. He looked like he'd been struck by lightning. "Oisín," he whispered, his voice a wrecked thing. "What? What was that?" I looked at him, my black eyes glowing with a faint inner light he didn't recognize. "Nothing. Go back to the tent." I could feel it now. The fire was back.
Chapter 5. Quinn. I stayed awake for hours, staring at the canvas roof of the tent. My lips were still throbbing, the ghost of his tongue still burning against mine. I shuddered, and this time it wasn't from the freezing mud or the damp air. This tent was different, one of the perks of the luck that had landed us proper steel. We had a real fire pit in the middle, and actual wool blankets that didn't smell like rot. There was only one bed, a narrow thing of stuffed straw, and Oisín had basically hauled me into it, brooking no argument. "Why'd you—" I whispered into the dark, my voice hitching. I turned my head slightly, realizing just how close he was. In the low orange glow of the embers, he looked like something out of a legend. His lashes were impossibly long, casting shadows against those high, pale cheekbones, and his hair was a silky, straight river across the pillow. But the heat coming off him was insane. It wasn't the sweaty, sick fever he'd had in my barn. This was like lying next to the core of a furnace. It was a dry, radiating thrum that made my own blood feel thick and slow. I watched him sleep, or pretend to, and my mind started to pull at the threads I'd been too distracted to notice. I thought back to the night I found him. He'd been lying in the dirt, pale and broken, but it was the thing next to him that didn't make sense. A dragon. Even dead, it was massive, scales like midnight and wings shredded and tangled in the brush. There was a spear of cold iron driven straight through its heart. Had he been riding it? There were others dead around the beast too. Men in armor I didn't recognize, their blood soaking into the moss. Oisín was the only one left breathing. North Sheep, I thought, the words feeling ridiculous now. Barn Village. A hot flush of embarrassment crawled up my neck. I'd spent a month feeling proud of myself for teaching a man who moved like a lord how to shovel manure. Had he just been naming the first things he saw around the farm? Was his home just a lie he'd made up while I was cleaning the soot off his skin? I felt like a fool. If he was a dragon rider, he was a high bonder, one of the people from the stories who lived in the clouds. It would explain why he stared at a water bucket like it was a puzzle and why he didn't know how to use a skinning knife. Someone like that would never have to work a day in their life. But why was he here? Why was a high bonder bleeding out in my hayloft instead of leading the king's charge at the front? He'd lied about everything, yet he'd kissed me like he was drowning, and I was the only thing keeping him grounded to the earth. I looked at him sitting in the dim light of the tent. I didn't know a single true thing about him. Don't think about it, I told myself, and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I stepped out of the tent to splash some freezing water on my face, my head still spinning from the heat of Oisín's skin and that bruising kiss from the night before. I didn't even make it to the water barrel. "Well, look at the little hero," a voice sneered from the shadows of the supply wagons. I froze. Barnaby stepped out, followed by Liam. They didn't look like the shaking, sobbing wrecks I'd seen in the trenches yesterday. They'd found some cheap ale and a bit of borrowed vanguard courage. Barnaby was holding a heavy iron tent stake, slapping it against his palm. I guess he'd gotten over his cousin's death. "Thought you were special, didn't you, Quinn?" Barnaby spat, stepping into my space. "Getting the good steel, hiding your pretty little refugee in a private tent while the rest of us freeze in the mud." "Leave it, Barnaby," I said, my hands balling into fists. "We're all in the same hell now." "We aren't in the same anything," he growled. He flicked the edge of my new breastplate with the iron stake. Who'd you have to lay down for to get this? Or was it the girl-faced freak? Maybe we should go in there and see if he's as soft as he looks. I bet he makes all sorts of pretty sounds. The red mist hit me before he could finish. I lunged, my fist catching Barnaby square in his mouth, the satisfaction of feeling his tooth break against my knuckles radiating up my arm. But I was one man. Liam tackled me from the side and then brought a heavy boot down on my ribs. I hit the mud, gasping, the world spinning in a blur of grey sky and brown filth. "Hold him up!" Barnaby barked, wiping blood from his chin. They hauled me to my knees, pinning my arms back. Barnaby stood over me, his face twisted in a jagged, ugly grin. He raised the iron stake, aiming for my temple. "Let's see if that thick skull of yours can—" "That is enough." The voice didn't come from the air. It felt like it came from the ground itself, vibrating hum that made the mud jump. Oisin was standing at the edge of the wagon. He wasn't wearing his armor. He was just in his thin tunic, his hair wind-whipped, his black eyes fixed on Barnaby. He didn't look sick anymore. He looked like the end of a long, dark age. "Oh, look," Barnaby laughed. "The porcelain doll is awake. What are you going to do, cousin? Bleed on me?" Oisin didn't answer. He blurred. It wasn't human movement. It was the strike of a viper. He caught the man, the one holding my left arm, by the throat. There was a sickening crunch, a sound like a dry branch snapping, and another head lolled at an impossible angle as he was tossed aside like a sack of grain. Liam let go of me, shrieking, but Oisin was already there. He grabbed Liam's wrist and twisted. I watched, paralysed, as the bone tore through the skin of the boy's forearm. Oisin followed it with a palm strike to the chest that sounded like a wet crate splintering. Liam flew back 10 feet, his chest caved in, dead before he hit the dirt. Barnaby dropped the iron stake. He scrambled backward, his heels digging into the muck. What are you? Quinn, help me." Oisin stalked toward him. His black eyes were starting to smoke, actual wispy grey vapour curling from the corners of his lids. "You touched what belongs to me," Oisin hissed. It wasn't his voice anymore. It was a dual-toned roar that vibrated in my very teeth. He pinned Barnaby against the heavy wooden wheel of the supply wagon. He didn't use a knife. He just pressed his hand against Barnaby's throat and I saw it, the glow. It started in Oisin's veins, a white-hot subterranean light that turned his ivory skin translucent. Barnaby didn't even have time to scream. Smoke began to pour from his mouth and eyes as Oisin burned him from the inside out. I watched in horrified silence as Barnaby's skin blackened and blistered, his body sagging as his lungs turned to ash under Oisin's touch. When Oisin let go, Barnaby was nothing but a charred, smoking husk. Silence fell over the area, heavy and suffocating, smelling of copper and ozone. Oisin stood in the centre of the slaughter, the blood of my childhood bullies splattered across his face like war paint. He turned his head slowly, those terrifying ink-black eyes locking onto mine. "Oisin," I whispered. I looked at the bodies, the snapped necks, the torn flesh, the blackened meat. You're... He knelt in the mud beside me, his fingers, still hot enough to sting, cupping my jaw. He looked at my swollen eye, and I saw a flicker of that vicious protective heat flare again. "Does it hurt?" he asked, his thumb tracing my split lip. I'm fine," I managed to choke out, "but they're all dead. Oisin, the guards. They'll hang us." He let out a short, dark laugh that made my hair stand up. "Let them come, little shepherd," he whispered, leaning in until I could taste the copper on his breath. He didn't care about the bodies. He didn't even glance at the charred remains of the men who had spent years making my life a living hell. Instead, he grabbed my tunic and hauled me behind the supply wagon, pinning me against the rough wood with a force that knocked the breath from my lungs. His mouth crashed into mine again, desperate and searing. I gasped, my head spinning from the metallic tang of blood on his skin and the sheer, impossible heat radiating from his chest. Oisín, wait! I managed to choke out, pushing against his shoulders. My face was flushing a deep, hot crimson. What are you doing? They'll see. Soldiers can't. We can't keep doing this. You are the source of my power, he muttered against my throat. He didn't let go, his hands gripping my waist like iron bands. What are you talking about? I whispered, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. I looked at his ink-black eyes, still swirling with that grey smoke. 2 men. It's wrong, isn't it? I'd been raised on the king's law. I knew what the village elders said. But as I looked at him, the memory of the tavern stories bubbled up, the ones about the monsters of Salvador. They said the high Bonda princes didn't follow our laws. They said the evil prince himself kept male consorts in his obsidian palace, men who were treated like kings and feared like gods. Oisín hissed, his thumb catching my lower lip and pulling it down. The glow in his veins was fading, but the heat remained, tethering me to him. In my world, we don't apologize for the fire that keeps us alive. Your soul is honest, it's heavy, and it's bright, and I am drinking from it. He kissed me again, slower this time, a claim that felt more permanent than any chain the king could forge. I groaned into the kiss, pulling him tighter and threading my fingers through his silky hair. We shouldn't, really. But the way his tongue swept against mine made the rest of the world feel like a dream I'd finally woken up from. As the kiss deepened, a strange sensation started in the center of my chest. It wasn't just heat. It was a pulse. A soft white gold light began to throb under my skin, radiating outward until my very fingertips felt like they were sparking. I felt my own exhaustion vanish, the bruises from the fight fading into nothing. Oisín suddenly yanked back, his breath hitching. His lips were swollen and red, and the tattoos on his ivory skin were pulsing like glowing runes, fed by the light coming off me. He stared at me, his black eyes wide with a shock that bordered on terror. What are you? He gasped. I stared up at him, my lips wet and my heart hammering. What do you mean? You healed me, he whispered, his hand trembling as he touched his own chest where his jagged scars had smoothed into flawless skin. The fire. It's roaring. Are you an oracle? I flinched back as if he'd slapped me. The word felt like a death sentence. My blood went cold, the golden glow under my skin snapping out like a snuffed candle. Nobody dared speak that word. Not since Ma and Da had fled the capital when I was a babe, hiding us in the furthest reach of the Sunderlands. It was the one secret we guarded more than life itself. It was forbidden. It was the reason I'd resigned myself to the forge and the war, because I knew that if the king or the high bonders ever found out what I was, I wouldn't be a soldier. I would be a resource. I turned to bolt, my boots skidding in the mud, but Oisín's hand shot out, his fingers like iron as he yanked me back against the wagon. Answer me, he hissed. Are you an oracle? Don't tell anyone, please, I begged, tears finally brimming in my eyes. Please, Oisín, I beg you. A flash of pure, draconic rage crossed his face, not at me, but at the realization itself. Then just as quickly, he forced himself to calm down, his expression softening into something pained as he ran a thumb over my cheek to catch a tear. No, he said softly. Of course not. You're safe. Ma and Da won't be, or Bess. They'll come for all of us, I whispered, my voice breaking. Please, don't say anything. They harvest us, Oisín. You know they do. He didn't answer right away, and the silence was worse than a scream. Every child in the Sunderlands knew the horror stories of the oracles, living conduits of pure life force. They were so rare that a single oracle could be harvested to heal and empower 50 dragon riders, their life force drained away drop by drop to keep the high bonders immortal and their beasts invincible. They weren't treated as people. They were batteries, wells that never went dry until the person inside simply withered into a husk and died. Oisin wrapped his arms around me, pulling me into the hard, protective curve of his chest. He held me so tight I could feel the thrum of his newly restored fire. "Do you honestly think I could, little shepherd?" he whispered into my hair, his voice thick with a promise that sounded like a threat to the rest of the world. I didn't crawl out of the dirt just to hand my heart over to a butcher. You are mine, and I do not share what is mine. Then the sky screamed. The mist shattered. 1 second, I was breathing cold air. The next, the atmosphere was a bright blue furnace. A wall of sapphire flame rolled across the vanguard's line. Men I'd grown up with didn't even have time to shriek. They just turned into glowing ash where they stood. "Dragons!" someone shrieked. Panic turned the camp into a slaughterhouse. I didn't care. I hadn't come here to run. I was a blacksmith. I knew how to hold a blade and how to stand my ground. My hands shook, but I gripped my short sword until my knuckles went white. This was my kingdom. This was my fight. "Quinn, no, get back." Oisin's voice was a jagged rasp behind me. I didn't listen. I couldn't. I saw a line of the king's soldiers breaking, trampled by their own fear, as a shadow the size of a cathedral swept over us. I roared, a raw, primal sound, and charged toward the tree line, where the first of the enemy riders were dropping from the sky. I was a fool. I was a boy with a rusted blade facing gods. "Stay behind me!" Oisin lunged, his hand catching the back of my armor, trying to haul me back into the shadows. "I'm a soldier!" I yelled, wrenching my arm away. "I'm not a porcelain doll, Oisin! I'm going to fight!" I threw myself at the first obsidian-clad rider who hit the dirt. I swung with everything I had, the vibration of the impact rattling my teeth as my blade sparked against his black shield. He was faster than anything I'd ever seen. He raised a spear of blackened silver, the tip glowing with a hungry blue light. I was dead. I knew it. Then Oisin was there. He didn't have a sword. He didn't need one. He stepped between me and the spear, his ivory skin suddenly blindingly bright. He caught the spear tip with his bare hand. The rider froze. The glowing silver hissed against Oisin's palm as it started to melt. Both of us stared at Oisin in disbelief, my jaw unhinging at his raw power. This was impossible. "Back away from him," Oisin commanded. It wasn't a shout. It was a dual-toned roar that made the mud under my boots vibrate. The enemy rider didn't strike. He didn't move. He stared at Oisin's face, at those ink-black eyes now swirling with thick grey smoke. Around us, more riders dropped from the clouds. 12 of them, 20. They circled us like wolves, their drakes hissing and snapping at the air. I raised my sword again, my back pressed against Oisin's, my heart hammering against my ribs. "I've got your back," I breathed. "I've got you, Oisin." I still thought I was protecting him. Even as the sapphire fire turned the world into a graveyard, I thought Oisin was the one in danger. Then the enemy general stepped forward. He didn't raise his weapon. He didn't look at the screaming camp. He walked straight toward us, his heavy boots thudding against the frozen ground. He stopped 5 paces away and did something that made the blood in my veins turn to ice. The general dropped to one knee. "My prince," the man rasped, fanatical reverence. "The High Bonders have searched every corner of the Sunderlands. We feared the fall had claimed you." He bowed his head, his forehead almost touching the mud. "Welcome back, Prince Vahl-Zulien." Chapter 6. Quinn. "What the f—" The words died in my throat as the enemy general hit the mud. He didn't just kneel, he collapsed, his forehead pressing into the filth at Oisin's feet. "The prince is alive," he bellowed, his voice cracking with a terrifying, jagged joy. "Vahl-Zulien has returned. The stars have aligned. The usurper Drahol will burn for this. My prince, the High Council, they were told you were ash. They were told the Great Black had fallen." He was talking so fast I could barely keep up. High Council, Prince, Usurper. The words were a blur of knives and blood. I looked at Oisin, but he was as still as a statue, his face masked in a shadow that felt colder than the wind outside. "Drahol," the general whispered. "The damned king. He's been purging the lineages since the moment your dragon went down. He told the people the Bonders had abandoned them, that the old blood was thin and useless. He's been slaughtering anyone who still carries the mark of the High Council, claiming he's unifying the realm under a crown of iron instead of fire." My stomach did a slow, nauseating flip. This wasn't just a war between kingdoms. It was a massacre within one. The damned king was a butcher who had waited for the dragons to falter so he could step over their carcasses to a throne he hadn't earned. "He's calling himself the Soulbinder now," the man continued. "He says the era of the High Bonders is over. He's hunting for an oracle to tether the remaining Drakes to his own bastard bloodline. He wants to be the only one who can breathe fire. If he finds out you're breathing, my prince, he'll turn this entire valley into a funeral pyre just to smoke you out." An oracle, that word again. It hit me like a physical blow, making my vision swim for a fraction of a second. It was the word I could never speak aloud. The word that had banished me from everything I knew and sent me hiding in the soot of a forge. I shoved it from my thoughts, forcing my breathing to stay even despite the terror clawing at my throat. I needed to go, to flee. I couldn't be here a second longer. I wasn't meant to exist here, in the crosshairs of a war between gods and kings, if they found me. If the damned king knew what was simmering under my skin, Oakhaven would be the first of many graveyards. The air felt like lead. I tried to inch back toward the wagons, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I hoped they wouldn't notice, that Oisin would be too wrapped up in his lost kingdom and his frantic soldier to see me trying to get away. I just needed 1 foot outside, 1 breath of cold air to start running and never look back. But I couldn't. I looked at Oisin, and the world seemed to tilt. He'd kissed me, touched me. Without knowing who or what I was, he cared for me. Like Ma and Da and Bess. It was a terrifying thought, one that made my knees feel like they were made of water. I didn't really know what love was, not the kind they write the big poems about. Was it something as small as teaching someone how to hold a bucket without spilling it all over their boots? Or was it sharing a single, threadbare cloak in the middle of the freezing mud, trying to steal a bit of warmth from each other? I wondered if it was found in the quiet laughter we'd shared when the sheep got loose, or the slow, stubborn rise of a flush on his cheeks when I'd say good morning and promise to never leave his side. Was it like all those grand songs of Venus and Adonis they sang at the harvest festivals, or the stories of the Sunderland maid and her white knight, all shining armour and tragic vows? I'd always thought love was a lightning bolt, something that changed the sky. But looking at him now, a fallen prince who didn't know a rake from a shovel, it felt more like a slow-burning coal. Something steady, something that made the thought of fleeing feel like tearing off my own limb. I had 1 foot toward the exit, toward safety and the shadows, but my heart was still anchored right there in the dirt next to him. If I stayed, I was a dead man. But if I left, I think I'd be something much worse. I watched his profile, the angular, noble line of his jaw, and the way his hand twitched toward the hilt of his sword. He was a creature of fire and blood, and I was a boy made of secrets and soot. And yet, I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I just waited for him to look at me, terrified of what he'd see when he finally did. Oisin didn't look at the general. He didn't look at the screaming soldiers dying 10 feet away. He looked at the sky. "Vir Marthis does not fall so easily," Oisin said. His voice wasn't the raspy whisper from the barn. It was a bell, a command. Then, the world began to shake. The biggest dragon I have ever seen landed, the downdraft from its massive wings flattening the supply wagons like they were made of dry straw. I nearly lost my footing as the sheer force of the wind hit me. Its long neck slithered over, scales clicking like plates of obsidian armour, and it lowered its head. The beast was a nightmare, Smoke curled from its nostrils, and its eyes were two pits of molten gold. Oisin reached out. He petted the snout, a genuine, terrifying smile breaking across his face. "I've missed you, old friend." "My prince, we must move," the general urged, scrambling to his feet. "The king's reinforcements are—" "The king has nothing left but smoke," Oisin interrupted. He turned to me. The sickly refugee was gone. In his place stood a god of war. Before I could even drop my sword, Oisin moved. He grabbed me by the waist and hoisted me with unmatched physical strength onto the back of the dragon. I felt like a sack of grain in his hands. He vaulted up behind me in one fluid motion, his chest slamming against my back and his arms locking around my middle like iron bands. "Hold on, Quinn," he hissed into my ear. We took flight. My stomach stayed on the ground as the beast surged upward. The force was like an anvil on my chest, pressing the air from my lungs. I clung to Oisin's forearms, my fingers digging into his skin, my eyes stinging from the sudden, freezing rush of the wind. I looked down. The entire king's army was a smudge of brown in the distance. A single breath of sapphire flame from the other drakes swept through the trenches. The greatest army in the world was gone, melted into ash in a matter of seconds. I turned my head slightly, catching the profile of the man holding me. Vahl-Zulien looked out over the horizon, his black eyes cold and triumphant. The sky screamed, and for the first time, I screamed with it. The descent into Salvador was a nightmare. I looked out over the dragon's wing, and the air in my lungs turned to ice. Below us, jagged black stone towers pierced the mist like rotting fingers clawing at the belly of the sky. There was no gold here, no white marble or streaming banners of the stories, only the oppressive, salt-stained geometry of a Gothic nightmare. The crenellations were sharp enough to draw blood from the clouds, and the gargoyles perched on the parapets seemed to track our flight with hollow, hungry eyes. This wasn't the glory that had fueled my fever dreams back at the forge. I had imagined a wide, sun-drenched field, a general's cloak snapping in the wind, a death met with honour for the sake of Oakhaven. Not this. The wind howling through the spires sounded like the screaming of the damned. I looked down at my hands, still stained with the soot of a world that felt a lifetime away. I was a blacksmith in a kingdom of monsters, held fast in the shadow of the greatest monster of them all. Each beat of the dragon's wings carried me further into a medieval cage of iron and bone, where honour was a foreign tongue, and the only thing that mattered was the dark will of the man who flew us toward the abyss. The great black drake banked, its wings cutting through clouds that tasted like sulphur. We landed in a courtyard of cracked basalt, the impact rattling my teeth. The second we hit the ground, we were surrounded. Hundreds of soldiers in midnight armour slammed their spears against the stone in a rhythmic, deafening beat. "Vahl-Zulien! Vahl-Zulien!" The chant was a roar. Oisin didn't even wait for the beast to settle. He slid off the dragon's back with grace and reached up, his large hands grabbing my waist again to haul me down. I stumbled against him, my legs shaking like water. I felt like a speck of dust in a storm of iron. "My prince!" Two women came racing out from the shadow of the great arched gates. The first was older, her hair a silver-white shock against skin as pale as Oisin's. She wore a gown of heavy dark velvet that looked like it was woven from night itself. The second was younger, fierce, with a scar running through her eyebrow and eyes that burned with the same ink-black intensity as the man beside me. They didn't look like the evil queens from the tavern stories. They looked like they'd been in mourning. "Vahl!" the younger one shrieked, her boots skidding on the stone as she threw herself at him. The older woman, the queen, stopped just paces away, her hand trembling as she touched Oisin's face. "The messengers said you were dead," she whispered. "They said the Sunderlands had swallowed you whole." "The Sunderlands tried," Oisin said, his voice ringing across the courtyard. He didn't pull away from them, but his hand stayed firmly on my shoulder, his fingers digging into my armour. He turned his head slightly, his black eyes tracking the way I was trembling. The younger sister stopped mid-embrace, her gaze snapping to me. She looked at my Sunderland steel, my dirt-streaked face, and the way I was leaning into her brother for support. "And who," she hissed, her hand dropping to the hilt of a curved black dagger, "is the peasant?" "He is the reason I am standing here, Ilara," Oisin said. "And he is the reason the Sunderlands no longer have a king." The evil queen's eyes drifted to me, cold and calculating. She looked at my hands, the hands of a blacksmith, and then back at the glowing runes on Oisin's neck. She knew. I could see it in her face. She knew I was an oracle. I wanted to run. I wanted to find a forge and hide in the smoke. But as the wind whistled through the black towers, Oisin pulled me closer to his side. "Welcome to the obsidian spire, Quinn," he whispered into my ear, his breath hot against my skin. "Try not to look so terrified. You're the only thing in this kingdom they aren't allowed to kill." The 3 days since we landed were a blur of suffocating silence. I'd been scrubbed within an inch of my life in a tub the size of a pond, filled with rose petals and milk water. They took my Sunderland steel and gave me robes of heavy, dark silk that felt like water against my skin. I didn't see Oisin at all, not once. I mean Prince Vahl-Zulien. The name felt like a mouthful of shattered glass. Vahl-Zulien. It was a name for tapestries and history books, for a man who commanded the very stars. And what had I called him? Oisin. I felt like the biggest idiot in 2 kingdoms. I'd named a high bonder prince like he was some stray lamb I'd found shivering in a ditch. Oisin. A soft, sturdy little name. I'd treated him like a doll I could play with, a project for a bored blacksmith's boy to fix up and teach how to handle a shovel. I'd lectured a god on the proper way to muck a stall. My face flushed a heat so intense it made the rose-scented steam feel like a breeze. Every time I'd called him that, every time I'd used that stupid, childish name, he'd just looked at me with those dark eyes and let it happen. He never corrected me. Not once. He'd let me prattle on, acting like his superior in the ways of the world, while he was probably counting the seconds until he could get back to his towers of bone and iron. The fact that he'd just taken it made everything 1,000 times worse. Was I just a joke to him? A funny little distraction to pass the time while his wounds healed? I looked at my reflection in the milk-clouded water and saw a fool wrapped in silk. I wasn't his friend, and I certainly wasn't his equal. I was just the peasant who didn't know enough to be afraid. That's why I needed to leave. The servants gave me tours of the palace, but the jagged black stone felt like it was closing in. Xyraxos was a monument to quiet luxury and cold violence. I was a prisoner in a room draped in enough silk to buy my village 10 times over. I should leave. I had to leave. If they found out I was an oracle. If. My throat closed up. I was a battery, a resource. I was meant to be harvested, and here I was, walking right into the mouth of the beast. On the 4th morning, the guards didn't take me to the gardens. They led me to the throne room. The doors were 50 feet of solid iron, and when they groaned open, my heart stopped. Oisin was sitting on a massive throne carved from black glass dragonstone. He looked lethal. The sickly man from my barn was dead. In his place was a king of shadows, his ink-black eyes scanning a court of stone-faced nobles. "Bring him forward," Oisin commanded. A man was dragged into the centre of the hall. He was battered, his armour had been ripped off, and he was covered in dirt and blood, but his face made my heart stop. He looked exactly like Oisin. He had the same angular jaw and the same cold, high cheekbones. If Oisin was the deep night, this man was the dark purple of a storm. I only knew him from the stories I'd heard back at the forge in Oakhaven. This was the prince's half-brother, the captain of the Red-Winged Dragon Dragoons. Seeing them together was like looking at a mirror that had been cracked in half. The whole court went quiet. It was so still you could hear the torches flickering. Everyone was waiting for the fire. They were waiting for Oisin to kill him. "Captain Drax," Oisin said, but his voice carried to every corner of the silent hall. "You worked with the damned king. You left me to die in the mud of a peasant village. But that wasn't your greatest sin, was it? Drax looked up, his face bloody, but his eyes still full of hate. I did what I had to, he spat. A prince who hides behind his mother's skirts doesn't deserve a throne. Oisin stood up, his tall frame a dark shadow against the glass throne. You didn't just strike at me, brother, Oisin said, stepping down the dais. You drove a spear of cold iron into Xyraxos. You slaughtered a son of the great shadow, a lineage that has guarded our blood since the first fire was struck. To kill a dragon is to spit on the gods. To kill my dragon is to declare war on the black scales themselves. The air in the room seemed to grow heavy, smelling of old smoke and ancient, restless anger. In our world, the dragons weren't just animals, they were sacred, their histories woven into the very souls of the princes who rode them. By killing Xyraxos, Drax hadn't just committed treason, he'd committed a sacrilege that could never be washed away. The defiance in Drax's eyes finally flickered out. He tried to move, but the guards held him down. You know our laws, brother, Oisin said, stopping right in front of him. If one of us commits such a crime, the whole family tree is burned. Every branch, every leaf. The black scales do not leave survivors to seek revenge. How is your son now? 3? Just a babe. Oisin chuckled, and the sound made my skin crawl. It was a light, hollow sound that didn't fit a room full of so much death. The captain's strength vanished. He started to tremble, his head bowing until it hit the cold stone floor. My prince. Mercy, please, he's just a child. He knows nothing of this. Mercy? Oisin let out a short, dry laugh. No. In killing my dragon, you've given me something much more valuable than a throne. He looked over at me for a second, his dark eyes unreadable, before looking back down at the man at his feet. I won't kill the boy, Drax. Not today. But his life belongs to the black scales now. He'll grow up in the shadow of the beast you murdered, a reminder of what happens when a dog tries to bite its master. His black eyes fixed on me where I stood at the edge of the crowd. He held out a hand, his fingers long and pale. I have met an oracle, Oisin announced, his voice ringing with a cold, triumphant clarity. The room went deathly silent. Then a collective, hungry gasp rippled through the nobles. 50 pairs of eyes turned toward me, greedy, starving eyes. He was mad. To announce it like that, to put the lives of my entire family at risk. The fear gripped me by the throat, choking the air from my lungs. You promised, I choked out. I stared at him, feeling like the biggest fool in 2 kingdoms, forever trusting the evil prince. You said you wouldn't. He swore. He promised me in the dark of that tent that I was safe. And here he was, putting a target on my back in front of every monster in Salvador, my family, Ma and Da, Bess. They were all as good as dead. You're a liar, I screamed. I turned and bolted. I didn't care about the guards or the stone walls, I just needed to run until my lungs burned. I didn't get 5 paces before strong arms wrapped around my waist, jerking me back with enough force to lift my feet off the floor. I thrashed against him, sobbing now, my fists thudding uselessly against his chest. You promised! You said you wouldn't say anything! My family! Quiet, Quinn, Oisin hissed into my ear, his grip tightening until it was almost painful. He didn't sound apologetic. He sounded like a man who had just won a war. Look at them. Look at their faces. I looked. The nobles weren't moving toward me, they were cowering. They don't want to harvest you, Oisin whispered, his breath hot against my neck as he pulled me flush against his silk-clad chest. They're terrified, because they know that as long as I have you, I am immortal. And they know that if any of them so much as breathes your air, I will turn this palace into a funeral pyre. He looked up at the court, his eyes smoking. The captain is rewarded with his life, a life he will spend behind bars for his crimes. He found me my crown's greatest treasure. The rest of you, you will kneel. The sound of 200 nobles hitting the stone floor at once was the most terrifying thing I'd ever heard. "I've got you, little shepherd," he murmured, his hand sliding up to cut my face, forcing me to look at him. "Did you really think I'd let them have a single drop of you?" The hall was so quiet I could hear the flickering of the torchlight against the damp stone. Every noble in the room was still pressed against the floor, their foreheads touching the basalt. "Anyone who touches him will die, because he will be my new consort." My heart stopped. Consort. The word felt like a brand. I was his, publicly, irrevocably, his.
Chapter 7. Oishin. My mother shrilled so loud I thought I'd go deaf. It shook the walls of my private solar, and I waved the servants out. "Have you gone mad?" she demanded. "He is a peasant. Not only that, a peasant from a rival kingdom, the one we are actively trying to destroy." "And an oracle," Alara beamed. I knew that greedy expression. I'd seen it on every minister in the court today. They looked at Quinn and saw a battery, a way to live forever. After the spectacle in the throne room, I had sent them all away. Even Quinn. He needed to rest, to recuperate from the shock I'd just leveled at him. I hadn't meant to betray him. I knew he'd spent his whole life burying that power under layers of soot and silence. Exposing him put a target on his back larger than any crown, but I couldn't risk the alternative. The damned king wasn't just starting a war for land or gold. He was hunting for someone. He was looking for the oracle. He was looking for Quinn. There was more to Quinn than even he seemed to understand. I thought back to those two people in Oakhaven, the old decrepit couple he called Ma and Da. I remembered the way they moved, the way their eyes stayed flat and vacant. They weren't his parents. They were puppets, empty husks played by a master hand. The thought chilled me to the bone. There was only one puppet master in this kingdom capable of such a feat, and if he knew Quinn was alive, the rest of the pack would follow soon. I had to move faster than the rumors. "He will be safe once the vows are spoken," I said, my voice cutting through my mother's protests. If Quinn married me, he wouldn't be a fugitive or a prize for the taking. He would be the consort of Xyraxos. He would fall under the protection of the Black Scales, a position that even the damned king wouldn't dare strike at openly. I needed to get ahead of this before it spiraled beyond my control. I'd lied to him, exposed him, and probably made him hate me. But I'd rather have him alive and resentful than dead and free. "With an oracle, we'll be unstoppable," Alara continued. She paced the length of my private solar. "Wow, brother, you've been hard at work." "Yes," I replied. I leaned back into the furs of my chair, feeling the weight of the day. "And to think he's been hiding all alone in Oakhaven." I sighed. "We will be married within a fortnight. I cannot wait a second longer. I need to claim what is mine. The dragon realm will settle, and the problem of my succession is solved." "You are forgetting one simple thing, son," my mother spat. She stepped into my space, her eyes flashing with cold fire. "You are engaged to O'Hara, the dragoness from Elsmire. She'll have your head if you break off the alliance. Without that marriage, you leave us open to war with the Heartstone Dragon Riders. And with the king, we cannot bear it. Please rethink this decision." "I cannot," I said simply. "I can offer her something else, much more valuable than a marriage to a man who doesn't want her. I will marry Quinn. I love him." And it was true. I loved the simple fool. He probably couldn't read or write a single word. I'd spent a month watching him squint at a quill like it was some kind of confusing stick. If I put a crown on his head, he'd probably just use the spikes to hang up his wet socks. But it was his courage that got to me. That iron courage was what made me realize he had such a good heart. I'd seen him stand his ground against men twice his size, with nothing but a rusted shovel and a stare. In a kingdom full of monsters, a heart like his was the rarest thing I'd ever found. Let them laugh about the blacksmith consort, all they wanted. I'd seen what Quinn did when things got dangerous. He didn't run. He just looked for the nearest heavy object and asked where the fight was. That was the kind of man who belonged by my side. Mother let out a jagged scoff. Does he love you? Because from the look of terror in his eyes, I don't think he does. He's a peasant, a shepherd, a boy. You will be king. Rethink this, I beg you. I stood to my full height. The shadows in the room lengthened as my internal fire surged. No, I said. My voice dropped into that dangerous draconic register. And if you degrade my consort again, I'll have your tongue. Mother paled. Her eyes flashed with rage and genuine fear. I didn't care. I was tired of the politics of vultures. Dismissed, I said, waving a hand toward the door. Prepare my chambers for tonight. We will start the oracle consummation before the wedding. Oh, you are devious, Alara chuckled. She winked at me as she followed our mother out of the room. I stood by the window. I looked out over the jagged black fingers of Xyraxos. I wanted everything to be perfect for him. Tonight I would finally begin to repay his kindness for everything he'd done for me. I knew he didn't want this palace. I knew being around these vipers wasn't his idea of a life. But I'd give him the world. If he wanted to be a general, then so be it. He could command my entire fleet. If he wanted to herd sheep all day or stay in the forge, then so be it. Anything. Quinn could have anything. The thought of him made my heart flutter in a way that felt more powerful than the dragon fire in my veins. We'd make it work. I'd burn the world down before I let it take him from me. The shadows in the solar deepened as the sun dipped behind the obsidian spire. I ignored the servants scurrying about to prepare my chambers. Their presence was a nuisance, a layer of static between me and the pulse of the dragon fire currently threatening to crack my ribs. This wasn't just a wedding. It was a tethering. The high bonder lore was ancient and stained with blood. When a prince of the dragon reach claims an oracle, the bond isn't just spiritual, it's a physical fusion of fire and light. My dragon, Vermathis, was essentially a conduit for my soul, but an oracle was a conduit for the world's very life force. By claiming Quinn, I wouldn't just be his king, I would become a god. Every wound I took would heal instantly. Every breath of fire I commanded would double in intensity. I would become an immortal engine of destruction. But the price was often the oracle themselves. The claiming was brutal, a raw, unchecked surge of draconic energy that most humans simply couldn't withstand. Their hearts would burst, or their minds would shatter under the weight of the dragon's consciousness. It was why we usually only mated with nobility, women whose bloodlines had been tempered by centuries of proximity to the Drakes. But Quinn was different. He wasn't a fragile courtier. He was a blacksmith. He was sturdy, forged by the heat of his own coals and the heavy labor of the Sunderlands. He was strong enough to survive me. He had to be. Desire burned through my veins, hot and demanding. I couldn't get the preparations finished fast enough. I found myself snapping at the chamberlains as they laid out the ritual silks and the ceremonial obsidian daggers. Every minute spent away from him felt like a century of starvation. I wanted his light. I wanted to feel that golden pulse beneath his skin again, the one that had stitched my broken body back together in the mud. By the time the moon began to climb over the jagged fingers of the city, my stomach was knotted with a rare, cold fear. I was Vahl-Zulien. I had killed men since I was 12. I had survived a fall from the stratosphere. Yet the thought of Quinn walking through those doors made my hands tremor. I knew he was terrified of me. I knew he saw me as a liar and a monster. He wasn't wrong. I was a monster. But I was a monster who was about to bind his soul to a shepherd, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure if I was the one doing the claiming, or if I was the one being caught. I stood by the massive black wood bed, my heart thudding a heavy draconic rhythm against my chest. The door creaked open. The scent of rose petals and milk preceded him, and for a second the dragon fire in my gut went silent, replaced by a devastating human ache. "Quinn," I whispered, the name a prayer and a threat all at once. When Quinn arrived, he looked absolutely miserable. The sight of him, pale and trembling in those oversized silks, made the dragon fire in my veins turn to ice. "Who dared upset you?" I demanded, the shadows in the room snapping toward him like whips. "Tell me their names." "I want to go home," Quinn sobbed. "I miss Bess and Ma and Daw. I want them to be safe, and the grumpy blacksmith. Please, I don't want to be a consort." I sighed, the weight of my crown feeling heavier than ever. I didn't have the heart to tell him that his Ma and Daw weren't real. They were puppets, led by a force far more sinister than anything he could ever imagine. His real parents were likely dead. "Quinn, you promised nobody would know, and now everybody knows," he choked out, his chest heaving. "I'm scared for them." "I already sent soldiers to collect your family and your sheep," I said, stepping closer until I could smell the rosewater on his skin. "They are under my protection, Quinn. I promise you, they are safer now than they have ever been." He wiped his snot and tears on his fine silk sleeve, looking small and broken. "Why me? I'm nothing special. I'm a peasant, a stupid kid who ain't done nothing but talk to trees and work the fields. What kind of oracle will I be? I'd embarrass you." I reached out, cupping his face in my palms. I dried his tears with my thumbs, staring into those pale blue eyes. There was so much light in him, so much goodness, it made my heart clench with a physical ache. "I'll protect you with everything I have, Quinn. I promise you. Be mine, please. I love you." He sniffed, his breath catching in a small hitching sound. "You... what?" "I love you," I said, leaning in to press a lingering kiss to his tear-stained cheek. "I love how you talk non-stop. I love your curly bird nest hair and your righteousness. I love everything about you. Marry me. Please, be mine." I don't know. I really want to go home," he whispered, looking down at his feet. "I'm sorry." My stomach dropped. The cold void that opened in my chest was worse than the fall from the sky. If that was what he truly wanted, how could I say no to him? "Okay," I swallowed, the words tasting like ash. "How can I deny you? I'll send you home. We don't have to get married. I'll visit you. Often." The thought of him leaving was a slow death. We'd spent months together, and seeing him walk away would likely kill me faster than any assassin's blade. Quinn suddenly wrapped his arms around my neck, pulling me close. "I don't know what to do, Oisin." "Marry me. Please," I whispered, feeling slightly frantic. My composure was shattering. "I need you." I buried my face in the crook of his neck, kissing the warm skin there and shivering. The dragon blood was racing in my veins, clawing and desperate to be free. I wanted him. I needed to claim him, to tether our souls before the world could pull us apart. "Ma and Da are safe?" he whispered, his voice small as he angled his head, allowing me to kiss up his jawline. "Yes," I breathed frantically against his skin. "And Bess." My hands were shaking as I reached for the ties of his tunic, slowly undoing them. "Please, Quinn, stay." "Oh, okay," he replied, his voice a soft, yielding thing. "But if I want to leave—" "I'll escort you back to Oakhaven myself," I promised, my black eyes locking onto his. I waited, my heart thudding a heavy draconic rhythm, until I saw that single hesitant nod. The second he gave it, I tore off his tunic, my skin finally meeting his in a burst of white-hot heat that made the very air in the room hum with power. The claiming had begun. The morning of the wedding was a blinding, crystalline white. I stood at the altar, the obsidian tiles of the great hall reflecting the winter sun like a dark mirror. I had never felt this much power. The claiming from the night before was still an electric hum in my marrow, a golden tether that made every breath feel like a victory. He was mine. I could feel the steady, stubborn pulse of his life force through the bond, even now. My body ached in a way that had nothing to do with the heavy ceremonial armor. We had spent hours tangled together, the air in the room thick with the scent of crushed rose petals and salt. The soft little sheep I'd found in that barn had been well and truly plucked. There was a fire in Quinn I hadn't expected, a raw, desperate hunger that matched my own. I could still feel the stinging heat of the bruises on my back where his nails had raked down my skin in the dark. He'd held on to me like I was the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly turned to glass. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel the ghost of his breath against my neck and the way he'd whispered my name. Not the prince's name, but the one I'd given him in the hay. I shifted slightly, the silk of my robes rubbing against the marks he'd left behind. It was a delicious sort of pain. It reminded me that beneath the oracle's power and the peasant's clothes, there was a man who could leave his mark on a king. He was terrified of what he was, but last night he hadn't been afraid of me. He'd been a storm. And as I watched the doors at the far end of the hall begin to creak open, I knew that no matter what the damned king or the high council tried to do, they would have to tear him out of my very soul to get to him. I stood with my shoulders squared, pride radiating off me like heat from a forge. To my left, my mother and the court stood in a stiff, suffocating line of velvet and jewels. To my right, my enemies, the lords of the High Council and the emissaries from Elsmire, watched me with eyes like daggers. Whispers broke out amongst the halls, a frantic buzzing of peasant and scandal and usurpation. I was too happy to listen to any of it. My skin was still buzzing from the touch of his hands, and the dragon fire in my gut was a purr of pure contentment. I straightened my ceremonial robes, my eyes fixed on the massive iron doors at the end of the aisle. I was ready. I wanted the world to see him. I wanted them to see the boy who had tamed a monster. The trumpets flared, a deafening golden blast that signaled the start of the procession. The doors groaned open. Only it wasn't Quinn. The hall went deathly silent as a single maid came rushing through the opening, her skirts bunched in her hands, her face as white as a shroud. She scrambled down the hall, her boots skidding on the polished basalt, until she collapsed on her knees at the foot of the dais. "I'm so sorry, my prince," she shrieked, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling like a death knell. "The consort, he's gone. Quinn has escaped." The silence that followed was louder than the dragon's roar. The bond in my chest suddenly spiked, not with the warmth of his presence, but with a cold, jagged void. My mother's intake of breath was the only sound in the room. I looked down at the maid, my black eyes beginning to smoke, the morning shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces of obsidian. He had left me. End part 1.